Hi there. Welcome to the Luminary Lens, where heart meets strategy and stories spark transformation. I'm Rebecca Kaykas-Wolff. I'm a corporate marketer, a salon curator, and your host for today. And today I have with me Kevin Perez-Allen, who is the Senior Vice President at Signal Group, which is a policy and advocacy communications firm based in Washington, D.C. I started my podcast series as well as I have kind of an associated salon business that I curate conversations amongst either B2B professionals and artists and other people to kind of demystify complicated things or just workshop ideas. And they've led to fundraising activities. They've led to like impact investing things and other activities. And they've been really great to kind of curate and cross-pollinate maybe topics that had challenges on either side. And that's something that really kind of speaks to my heart as a marketer, because I always saw in corporate cultures, the biggest issue was just alignment, as you can imagine. So to hear what you spend your time on, I would love for you to just introduce yourself and maybe explain what you do, how you got started, and what you're focused on right now.
So yeah, I am, as you mentioned, I'm a senior vice president at Signal Group. We are a modern public affairs firm based in DC, but we work with clients all over the country. I got started in political communications, I want to say right around the time I graduated from college in 2005, very long time ago. And, you know, I grew up a big political nerd. So I was 6 years old in the 1988 presidential election, and I begged my mom to let me stay up past my bedtime so I could watch the returns come in as a, first grader, because I was so interested in the process and what was happening in the election, just all of the media that went into it, despite the fact that in the last 40 years, I think that's maybe the election with the least personable candidates that we've had. But even so, it was still such an interesting thing for me. I was also devastated when Dukakis lost, and as a 6-year-old, I wasn't able.
I was a delegate for Dukakis in high school.
Were you really? I love it. I was a 6-year-old who was all about it, but unfortunately, and as a 6-year-old, when you don't get your way, you cry. That kind of really got me started, got me interested. I was just always interested in politics. And on the other side of that, I grew up very poor. We were homeless 3 different times in my childhood. We had it was rough. It was, single mom. My dad was in and out of the picture, addiction and alcohol issues and things like that. And so there was, my draw to politics was beyond just the spectacle and the interest and all of that. It was personal. Exactly. It was, as I got a little bit older, I started understanding how these political decisions at the national level, but then also at the state and the local level, impacted my daily life, impacted my family, my friends, my community. And so when I went to college, by the way, the first person in my family to do so, I knew 2 things. 1, I wanted to do something in politics. 2, I wanted to take as few math classes as I possibly could.
And maybe 3, you wanted to make a difference, because that backstory would tell me that you were motivated by something a little bit beyond maybe the normal college freshman.
Generally, yes. My thought was if I could get into politics, I could make a difference that way. I always thought just being able to make policy, being able to have new, unique ideas would be able to kind of put me in that realm. And so, when I was in college, it was figuring out, what do I do in politics? What do I do on campaigns? Am I a candidate? Am I an operations person? Am I a canvasser? Am I a strategist? What do I do? Am I a policy wonk? The answer to all of those was no. And what it was I know how to communicate with people. I've always been able to, 1, write. Writing has always been a very big, strong suit of mine. But 2, it was being able to be in a conversation, get a feel for what somebody is thinking and what their kind of general viewpoint is, and be able to take my thoughts, my beliefs, my ideas, and explain it to them in a way that essentially was translated to the way that they think. And so I've always had that. If we could call anything a superpower, I know that's like a popular question. If you have one superpower, what is it? Mine is really translation, and not language translation, although I do speak Spanish. It is translation between ideologies. I'm able to speak to people based on what their kind of worldview is. And so that's really been the arc of my career, with a lot of media relations involved. But it's really been figuring out how to message to different audiences.
I love that you contextualize it in terms of translation, because that really is what communication is, right? You're demystifying concepts and you're trying to relate it, make things relatable. I was a journalism major, also poli-sci, complete nerd. Did some of the things. I worked in the United States Senate as an Idaho intern, so very conservative, traditional values. But I was that Dukakis delegate in a high school. So complete political science policy nerd myself. And I found myself translating that into journalism, right? Because I really wanted to be a believer and I wanted to help people understand what was happening. Along those lines, though, I also recognized how challenging that was, because people's belief systems are so incredibly rooted, based on maybe religious values or their social structure. That said, in the role that you have now, and the reason I really wanted to have this conversation with you is that we have such polarization politically in our country, but also globally. I have a daughter that's going to film school in Berlin. And while that sounds like super fancy, she did that because she's really having a hard time figuring out what she wants to do. She's a creative, landed in business school, and didn't like it and said, I did the exact opposite. But what she's learning in that market is that people really don't like American politics. There is an appetite that is completely different than what we deal with. And I know that we've got such a polarized state. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Like, let's start in here, what you're doing from a U.S. diplomacy perspective. When we talked, a couple of months ago, when you were telling me about the work that you're doing in other countries, even though in your intro you didn't mention that part, what you're doing with other countries to help them understand our policy. If you could break that down a little bit, I just think it's so valuable that people understand what it takes for diplomacy to happen and the type of work that you and your firm do.
Absolutely. Yeah. We do work with multiple foreign embassies. I unfortunately cannot speak specifically about who and which countries publicly, but they are foreign countries. And so essentially, everything flipped about a year ago in the election. So regardless of what side of the aisle you reside on, politics and DC and the way to speak to lawmakers, to the government, it all shifted last year around November, because the way that this administration and the supporters and those that are aligned speak about politics is very different than the old institutional ways that DC tended to operate, that political and government type of circles tended to operate.
The differences, was that due to presidential shift? And so the regime change kind of like made things different. Is that the impetus for that shift?
It absolutely is. And it didn't wait until they came into office. Everything kind of shifted immediately. It was the anticipatory, because we had been here before 8 years prior. Everybody kind of had an understanding of like, okay, this was what the communication style was like. Every administration has a different communication style. But I would say the Trump administration has a very different communication style than some of the other, there was always just a very like institutional, this is how we do things, and it's going to change lightly from administration to administration. But this is a very, very, very different way of doing things, which makes a lot of sense just given President Trump's background as a TV personality, as a reality TV star, as he was a tabloid personality before that. His whole thing was his brand. So the way that he speaks, and it's not really just limited to him. If you had anybody from entertainment in a political position like this, there's a very specific way that they talk about things. It's very bombastic. It's very huge compared to more reserved, lifelong politicians. And so I saw that coming in. I saw that happening. I mentioned this to you, and this isn't specific to the public diplomacy, but I did this 6-month deep dive into conservative media outlets. And so I consumed everything conservative media. I mean, the podcasts, all the websites, all the One American News and Fox News and all of these outlets. I read all of the stuff. You'd be surprised. Some stuff on the far right is primarily advertisements with occasionally a story. It's a lot of, but then you have like genuine news outlets where a lot of them are thinking of themselves as, we are the New York Times of the right. And so they consider themselves very serious journalists. It's just like the New York Times has a more left-wing leading kind of thing. We have more right-wing. So I consumed all of this, and I started figuring out the way that they speak, the way that they talk, the narratives that tend to get pushed, quite a bit. And so when we saw right at the beginning the announcement of tariffs are going to hit every one of these foreign countries, it's going to be massive. There's, it's going to just upend everything. We knew, okay, we've got to start talking to these foreign countries and start telling them, hey, as you're talking to the administration, as you're talking to Senate and House leadership, as you're talking to agencies, this is what you need to talk like. This is how you need to speak. These are the things you need to touch on. And the biggest thing is, because you aren't American, you need to find the cultural similarities, which is a lot easier for a Canada or UK and Australia, a little more difficult for a Qatar, countries like that. But there are things that bind all of us together in the world. And so it's all about finding those types of similarities and speaking to the administration in that way. So I did trainings, myself and a couple of my colleagues, we did trainings with multiple foreign embassies for about 3 months straight. It felt like we had 3 or 4 a week that we were doing just over and over and over and giving the same advice. But it was really helpful because the questions that they had told me that they understood, we realize the way to talk now is so different than what it's ever been, but we don't know how to speak like that.
Normally, those countries, their communication style and the historical or the legacy kind of approach that they have, that doesn't really change. But we change it in America. Like, we package it. We go big. We're marketers, And I think that's the nuance right here, is that what you're talking about and why it's so important, like this demystifying process, is that we actually package communications as a strategy. Right. And we've probably done this politically for a very long time, probably starting maybe with the Kennedy era, to a certain degree. But with that, when you're talking to these diplomats, what's their aha moment? I've heard you say that it's like, oh, we don't know how to do that. We need to lean in and do that. But what's maybe one of the biggest misconceptions that they have? And or the second part to that question is, does that impact their ability or appetite to work with the United States in certain capacities? Or do they understand that it's a communication and packaging kind of situation? Does my question make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely makes sense. I will answer it kind of backwards. In terms of their appetite, through my conversations, I can say the appetite is not great. But their willingness is high because they understand how incredibly powerful the United States is. You can't just not work with the United States in this world. I mean, you can if you're North Korea and you want to be a pariah, but that's kind of it. So there is an understanding of, we don't like this, but we know we have to do it. And that's important. So that's why they would hire us to come in and do these presentations and talk to them and coach them. And so I think the big aha moment was just, and this is not even just foreign countries. This is talking to advocacy organizations and companies and telling them this is how you talk to the administration. But it was the realization that the way that a lot of other countries talk, the way that the UN talks, the way that a lot of advocacy organizations talk to people, is they speak, when you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they speak to people from the very top. Things are aspirational. They talk about systemic things. They talk about global entities. They talk about being like a good global citizen. They talk about things like climate change and how that's going to impact things 20 and 30 and 40 years from now. And the problem with that is that assumes all of the bottom parts of Maslow's hierarchy are met. And the reason MAGA Republicans have been so successful and so much more have cut into working class voters and things like that, so much more than traditional Republicans did, is because all of their messaging is focused on the bottom levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They speak to, I call it survival messaging. They speak to survival needs. So, for example, this is the metaphor I like to give, is if you are in a river drowning, two options. You don't want to hear why you fell into the river. You don't want to hear the reasons why other people have fallen into the river. You don't want to hear that, you might be a little responsible for why you fell into the river. You don't want to hear that. You want somebody to do two things: throw you a rope and point to who pushed you in. And that is the messaging to a T. It's all about your specific needs, and then generally demonizing somebody because you have to have a scapegoat, because that's a powerful way to message.
Wow. When you break it down like that, it'll make me watch every single news clip differently. Like, honestly. And it actually, to me, it actually removes the personal nature of it. And it's a winning strategy. It's super crystal clear. Probably why Caroline Leavitt does such a great job. She's amazing at her job.
This is the really difficult thing because, I have worked in Democratic Party politics for a long time. I'm a self-described, well, now I'm a self-described moderate, but, I'm a self-described liberal, moderate Democrat. I know it's hard for people to admit things like Caroline Leavitt's great at her job. She really is. That Donald Trump is wildly charismatic, and that is a big reason for his appeal. Also, that's a big reason why he does really well, even when his party doesn't do as well, because he has that charismatic element. But he is a master of this type of messaging. And another reason I can say that his party isn't as successful is they're embracing the messaging, but they aren't as good at it as he is. And they're not as good of messengers and deliverers of this as he is. The podcast hosts are. These bombastic personalities absolutely are. But the actual elected officials are not. And so that's where, Democrats have an opportunity. But most Democrats are terrible at this messaging.
It's kind of funny that you say that, because I think that the best people at their jobs are people that genuinely love what they're doing, right? And actually love the comms part, right? So I'm a corporate marketer in some of the nerdiest technologies like big data, SaaS stuff. I've leaned into a lot of AI things and consulting, and it's nerdy stuff. But I genuinely love the selling and the positioning and the comms process. Like, I can literally sell, like, drink the Kool-Aid and want to talk about it with everybody. And I think that, Trump might be one of these personalities that are like that. And the bombastic personalities genuinely like what they do and probably get energy from it. And I would imagine, and I would love your feedback about like the type of archetype of person that goes into politics is probably more like a policy person. I've worked with policy people, in companies like Microsoft and Shell, and they have a different set of beliefs and values, and more introverted than extroverted, I would actually argue, a lot of cases. And so that command of media, again, going back, to Kennedy, he got it. And it's fascinating to me that even though we know that, and even though that we know that we've got a broadcast world, right? Everything is this. Why more people that have a platform know that they need to sell the platform don't actually invest in this type of strategic communications and really build up great spokespeople within their organizations and take it more seriously? I'm curious what you see, because you work with a lot of different organizations, and it's almost like an afterthought.
This is the great struggle of comms across every single industry, is people don't realize that they need comms until a crisis hits, or they don't take it seriously, or they think of it as a luxury as opposed to an absolute necessity. I mean, I think we've seen a little bit of a shift in recent years where we're now seeing companies hiring chief marketing officers, chief communications officers, especially. I think that has been a nice shift. I'm happy to see it as a comms person, but you still don't see comms people outside of like a communication shop moving into a CEO role, moving into a president role. It's always operations, or it's sales, or it's something like that. In an advocacy organization, it's usually your policy person, whoever your chief policy officer eventually becomes, or your programmatic person. One of those two usually becomes the CEO or the executive director, or whatever it happens to be, because comms is still not seen as important to the mission of whatever company, organization, etc., as these other things are. And it really is incumbent on us as comms people to do that, but it's difficult. It's difficult to change those minds, even with all, as you pointed out, all of the evidence points to comms is what moves things. Comms is what moves your sales.
It's also, it reminds me that when you were talking about kind of like the ceiling, if you will, for professionals in our industry, the revenue generation obviously is critical for most companies, and governments should function the same way, quite frankly. I think with that kind of mentality, if your comms world can't actually show ROI and upside and all of that, it is a more difficult set of conversations to have, right? You have to be able to move business, and you have to prove the value of doing that. That's fascinating. This is like a part of this conversation that I didn't really know that we would talk about, and I really loved that we did, because I think it's really important that people think about like the business and how even in our government and our policymakers and big celebrities, right, that are in that universe are actually constructing their business and how they know that they're actually going to make an impact and win. And to your point, getting back to the entertainers that have then flipped over and become, policy leaders or diplomats, there's a reason they're so effective. And I think that is incredible. I would like to shift gears a little bit and just talk about the polarization, getting kind of back to that with our, left and right. And the work that you're doing, I think, can illuminate how you actually build bridges. We talked a little bit about like the structure and some of the strategies going into this and being laser focused on that, maybe developing personalities, but then talk about like, how do you build these bridges when there's such disparate like viewpoints? What's kind of the plan and process that you actually help organizations or governments with that can actually do that and create that more connective tissue between very polarizing viewpoints?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so it kind of goes back to what I was telling you about the similarities. It's where are we the same? And rather than do that in a very trite way of, hey, you and I both believe in X, that doesn't feel authentic. It's more about what are the things that we share, even if it doesn't seem like we share things. And that is where during these presentations and some of what I've done is a lot of, here is the language that you don't want to use when you're talking to this group of people. These are terms that don't work well. For example, if you are a progressive activist and you're talking to a MAGA conservative or just a general Republican, if you're talking to them and you're trying to either get them to come to your side or understand your point of view, when you start a conversation with, well, as a Latino, well, as a woman, like when you do things like that, as somebody from the LGBTQ community, you immediately are creating a fence between you because you're saying, I am this and you are not. And so I am speaking from a different perspective and I am speaking from over here. And that's an immediate dividing line. And so, it's funny, the thing that I learned about this, I actually learned from my grandfather. So my grandfather was born in Mexico and then moved here as a very little kid and then fought in World War II. And he was maybe the most patriotic person I've ever met in my life. But he always talked about himself and his identity as he's not Mexican American, he's not Latino, he's not Chicano. He is an American of Mexican descent. It's all about like, I am an American first, I am all this other stuff second. And so when I've worked with a few healthcare advocacy organizations who are really trying to figure out the message around Medicaid and like talk a little bit about that. And when they come into these conversations with more conservative legislators, it's like, how do we talk to them? A lot of them work in places like, downtown LA, where the doctors are Latino, the patients are Latino. Most people speak Spanish or a little bit of English. And when they're talking to somebody from Mississippi whose entire district is conservative and white, they don't care as much about that. And so you can't go in and say, we have a disadvantaged group of Hispanic people in my district and that we're treating and they need access to this, because it's not going to land. But when you go in and you say, look, I am an American, my patients are Americans first, they're everything else after, and in America, this is what we do. You're leading with this shared identity, this shared values, exactly. And that is an immediate door opening. Even if it's like a sliver, it's still a door opening, because you have to have that little bit of crack in order to be able to become that trusted messenger.
And I do notice, actually, it's interesting when you were talking earlier about all of the media that you would follow, like when you were trying to upskill your knowledge of maybe conservative politics versus more liberally focused. Fox News has changed their entire platform, and they're mostly running, it's almost like C-SPAN with a couple of like interstitials, which is fascinating to me. I can hear what you're saying to be true when you hear the White House talking. It's always, here's the unifying principle and then the thing, like they're following the script. And that guidance is really, really important. I wonder how you do that when you feel so disadvantaged, because I would imagine that the reason that people say, well, as a Latino, that, just as an example, or I could say as a mom of three working, all of these other like things that label me, I have my own very unique set of disadvantages that might not, to your point, be a disadvantage for somebody else, or they might not care, right? And I might not walk out the door and people say, oh, that woman looks disadvantaged, because I know that I don't look it, but I have my things. And so when people generally say that, well, as a something, it's usually from a place of maybe pain or place of wanting to seek a little bit of authority, but it comes from somewhere that's probably a really emotionally charged space. And so when you're dealing with that, and that's kind of where we are right now, like with politics, we're in this emotionally charged, like place of disadvantage, and everybody's got their pocket of it. How do you build that bridge from there? So totally hear you on the unifying principle, but when you're so emotional and you're really feeling it, I think, to me, I see it a lot with like the special interest groups and more left, because they're in pain. Like there's a lot of people that are scared. Fear does not bring great positive, it's not a great change agent, a leader. I had John Hagel on my very first podcast. He writes about fear as the great motivator, and it's a destructor, right? And getting past that would be an enormous benefit for us. And so I wonder kind of your thoughts on that.
You can't get past fear if you're afraid, if something's happening. That's going to be part of it. And right now, I absolutely understand it. There's a lot of people who are rightfully afraid. And this is the hard thing about this type of work is, it's not a magic bullet. It's a step forward. And sometimes it's multiple steps forward. But you have to think about this when you are having these conversations. If you have the opportunity to talk to more conservative voters, if you have the opportunity to talk to a Republican congressman or whoever it happens to be, what is your goal? What's your ultimate goal for this? Is it to get a narrative win of, well, I said all of this stuff that is on my talking point list. I said, as a Latino, I am this, you're a fascist, yada, yada, yada. Was that the goal? Because for some organizations on the left, I mean, look, I'm equal opportunity here, and on the right, that's all they want. There's no ultimate goal at the end. It's just, I want to be able to show all of these people that I did this. Yeah. Or it's chaos. Exactly. Or like, I just need to show these activists that, follow me that I stood up to whoever. So if that's your goal, fine, lead with whatever, talk about it in whatever way you want. It doesn't matter. But if your goal is actual change, I really want to change this person's mind. you have to be able to swallow your pride. You have to be able to think, as difficult as it is. I've been in a lot of pain before as well. I am not personally super comfortable with what is happening right now, but it's really difficult, but you have to swallow that pride. You have to put your fear aside and show your own empathy. You have to try and understand what that other person sees, not see them as just an evil entity who wants to see everybody else die. Why do they think the way that they do? And that's where the questioning comes in. That's where look, we're both, yeah, exactly. Be curious about them. Ask them about their upbringing. Even if it's just, I've had this where I've met people where I didn't know what their political background was. I met them at a happy hour or whatever it is. And we just started chatting. And as I'm curious, so I ask questions and I hear things about their background. It's DC, we start talking about politics at some point. And then I get a sense of what their politics are. And sometimes they're very, very right. And as I'm hearing about their background, a lot of times they don't have a super different background from me. It's just the way that they view the world and the way that they've viewed why things happened the way that they did. It's the reason things unfolded was because of this is the way that they think. And for me, it's more on the other side of I think the reason things unfolded are this. It doesn't mean one of us is wrong or right. It just means we have a shared experience. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about where we have the same feelings about things.
Yeah, I love that measured approach because that's actually collaboration. You talk about, like, if you've studied conscious leadership principles, it's all founded on that, right? And I do think that it's interesting. And, if you will, just for a second, like your background not being easy has probably lent you at an early age to really lean into those empathetic qualities even before you knew what empathy meant, because you actually felt a lot of difference. And trauma informs a lot of different types of change and empathy-driven things. I had similar background, very poor, moved around tons, but, I was a blonde white girl. And so, I had advantages, but I was not well off. And so I hustled, like I worked really hard. And that I do think informs that ability to actually think rationally about things. You know what I mean? In a way. And I don't say that with judgment, because there's a lot of reason for people to be extremely passionate on both sides and have a lot of fear and be really committed to their platform and viewpoint. What really is scaring me now is, as a mother of 3 people, I'm seeing, bus boards around, what is it called?
Selective service.
Selective service, thank you. There's billboards around San Francisco on the back of buses and things. I haven't seen advertisement for that ever, like in our generation. We've never seen advertisements for that.
I've only seen it at the post office when I signed up when I turned 18.
There's advertisements now. Those types of indicators worry me, because that divide happens when we stop talking. And if you're rooted in being right so much of the time, there's absolutely nothing good, of goodness that's going to come from that. And so that leads me to ask a question: where are you seeing good collaboration from 2 sides working? Like in the companies that you work with, do you see collaborations taking place and little maybe seeds of hope, if you will, like in the line of work that you're doing? Because this is my whole reason for being. I want to change this. And I don't, as one person, I don't know how to make that happen other than talking about empathy-driven leadership, empathy in marketing. I'm working on a book to actually drive KPIs when you actually can target more efficiently with those types of characteristics. Like super nerdy, who knows? But, the idea is that I really care about this. And I'm a mom of 3, and my people that are going to be in the world, I want them to have a really amazing place to land in the world. And this is the thing that terrifies me the most, is our inability to communicate. So I'm curious where you're seeing it working.
Where I'm seeing it working is organizations that are understanding they need to expand who they are talking to. I would say November was a big wake-up call to a lot of groups where there was this, well, all we need to do is continue to talk to our people and, figure that out, and they'll come out and we'll be fine. And now there's this slow realization of, you know what, we need to talk to these people, because people that don't know who we are, don't agree with us, are actually impacted by this stuff, but they don't know it because we haven't been talking to them. And it's all about talking to people in the language they understand. As I kind of mentioned at the beginning, I talk about it in this way. I tell people during my presentation that I give, I tell them, like, look, let's say you only speak English and you are dropped in rural France. You're dropped in a tiny village. Nobody speaks a word of English. I don't know if that's true in rural France, but let's just say it is. Nobody speaks a word of English. We're just going to pretend it is. This is Beauty and the Beast. And so you're dropped in rural France. You don't speak a word of English. You have two choices. You can immediately get to work learning a little bit of French so you can get food and shelter and find what you need in order to survive. Or you could just double down and scream at people in English. The problem is that a lot of the groups, what they have been doing and what they're finally starting to understand that they can't do, is they were doing the second one. They were just screaming at people in a language they didn't understand. And when those people didn't understand them, it was immediately well, you are just a racist, xenophobe, sexist, misogynist, you're Islamophobic, it's all of these things, instead of, you know what, you not understanding what I'm saying because I'm not speaking your language. Let me reframe without changing my policies. We're not replacing, we're just reframing. Let me talk about it in your language. Maybe that'll get you on my side. And it works so well when that happens too.
It's kind of funny because if you've ever been like in a personal relationship and going through therapy, it's like the same kind of steps, right? And again, it's like diffusing the emotion out of it so that you're more capable of hearing somebody in their other language. I think that that's a really great way to frame it, right? That there is a different language and it's coming from a lot of different variables, but I'm still shocked at the inability of really smart people that just refuse to do it. And then I ask myself, what is that huge fear motivator that's being triggered with your inability to be able to listen? You know what I mean? It's not going to hurt to listen.
If you're talking to somebody about climate change and you're saying, we need to do something or the oceans are going to rise in 10 years and average temperature is going to go up 2.5 degrees Celsius. If you're saying that to somebody who is just trying to figure out how they're going to pay rent next week and how they're going to put food on the table to their kids, you're talking at the top of Maslow's hierarchy's pyramid and they're living at the bottom. There is a massive disconnect. What you're saying to them feels abstract. It feels completely disconnected from their life. And oftentimes it feels condescending. And this is what I tell people. I say, you have to talk to people, not just in the language, like I said, but also understanding their situation. You can't talk about big systemic change when all they want is to make sure they can pay their bills and make sure their kids can go to school with a full stomach. I mean, that's such a massive difference in opinion. The problem is that a lot of these very smart people you're talking about are so comfortable with all the things on the bottom. I mean, thankfully, I'm at a point in my life where I'm very comfortable with these things on the bottom. So I can think about these things at the top. But I remember for a very long time my whole thing was, how do I make sure that I have dinner tomorrow? Like it was these types of thoughts. And so there's too many people in this country who are operating on that level, and we're not talking to them. And if we're not talking to them, they're not listening to us.
It's a luxury to be able to have a choice when it comes to like these types of decisioning, criteria. It all sounds so far away and foreign, just trying to survive, or take care of your children. And life circumstances change that too. I mean, it can impact you. And so those are really, really great thoughts. Thank you for that. I'd be curious to hear what you've personally heard about the work that you're doing, because I follow you on LinkedIn. I see some of the content that you're creating, and I notice that there is a divide, when you, even in our business cycle, one side is a little bit more apprehensive to share their thoughts and feelings than the other side. And I'm curious how we as professionals, like just from a professional perspective, can get over that hurdle and that it's not a bad thing. And if I want to create cohesion, that doesn't mean that I believe in one way, right, over another thing. It doesn't mean that I'm a believer. It just means that I want to create cohesion because I actually value peace over anything else. And so I'm curious, like, what your thoughts are.
It's funny. I always say, I am very much a Libra. I'm all about balance. I'm always trying to find that balance. And it's true. The problem with it's not just the polarization of our politics and our discourse, it is the desire for purity in our discourse and in our politics and in our belief systems. So it's this idea on both sides of the aisle, especially as you get further and further to the right and to the left, that any deviation from the way that I think is evil and is wrong, and you are a sellout and you are not part of my movement. And you could agree on 99.9% of things, but you don't agree on this one thing. Suddenly you are an evil, horrible human being. Yeah, and you might as well be the other side, whereas the other side thinks you're crazy, you're part of that side, and so you end up being kind of like ostracized by both sides. And so there is this very much, I am this, and if you don't agree with me, you're bad. And so, I'm very much a person who is always trying to find okay, you're somebody who's way on the left. I don't agree with a decent amount of what you have to say, but let's talk. Let me understand why you believe the things that you do. Listen to why I believe the things that I do. And let's find, there's going to be common ground. This is the thing I tell people. There's always going to be common ground. No matter how far apart you think you are, you're always going to have something in common with that person. It's not always going to be political. Sometimes it's going to be, we root for the same sports team. Both of our favorite singers are Taylor Swift. I'm just bringing her up because she just had an album drop today. Like, we both are big fans of this, Robert De Niro movies are our big thing. You're always going to find things that you both like. And if we can do, even when you disagree on 100% of things, if you can find the humanity in the other person and understand that I actually really like this person, there's a lot that can happen. Like, I think of one of the most famous examples is Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Antonin Scalia were like best friends. They were complete ideological opposites, completely different. I mean, even physically looking at them, it was very, very different people, but they saw the humanity in each other. They understood that they weren't going to agree on things at the Supreme Court level, or rarely they were going to agree on things, but they understood it didn't matter. Like, it was about their friendship. And while other people might say, well, that's great for them, they're privileged and they're elite and they're Supreme Court justices, but what about those of us that are struggling? It's like, yeah, but when you see the humanity in the other side, you're not so dead set against listening to what they have to say and potentially changing your mind on things. The only way to create change and to be able to get somebody to think at least a little closer to why I believe things the way that I do is for them to see you as a human being on their level who has other things that they share and that, that like you. And so that's a big, big motivator for this kind of work.
For me, it's like it endorses the argument for more community, more collaboration. I'm in tech. And so and in Silicon Valley, all of the conversations are around AI, right? And there have been a lot of rifts that have impacted comms and marketing teams, right? As they always do, and then others as well. But the reality is that there's also more argument for liberal arts educations and building communities and cohorts, because it is imperative that we create this knowledge transfer amongst human knowledge and build that connective tissue between all of us. So I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. This was really fun.
Thank you. This is great. No, I appreciate it as well. And I definitely want to be part of one of your salon dinners when I'm on the West Coast.
I would love that. I mean, that was the whole purpose of them, is like to demystify things. I host these sessions that leaders will attend, and sometimes there's tears, sometimes it's emotional because you can actually workshop real things and never record them for that purpose. It's a really great opportunity, and I'm actually using them to even test investment funds and other things that people have just reached out to me. But I'm just a naturally curious person. I like interviewing. I like having these types of conversations. I like learning. Every single time I do, I learn something, which is such a valuable thing, and I'm really lucky. So thank you.
Thank you.
We'll wrap up. So thank you so much for watching and listening. Really appreciate it. If you've got any feedback to share, #Luminary Lens, and you can find us on Spotify and Apple. Thank you so much.